Hey Slate listeners, I'm Christina Cauterucci, the host of Slow Burn, Gaze Against Briggs. I want to tell you about a special event we're doing at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City on June 13th. To celebrate the new season of Slow Burn and Pride Month, we'll be hosting an exclusive taping of the show with special guests including Eric Marcus, the host of Making Gay History. We'll dive deeper into this season and talk about the lasting impact of the Briggs Initiative and the continued fight over LGBTQ rights in schools. Plus, we'll share some behind-the-scenes stories and never-before-aired tape from this season. It'll be the perfect way to celebrate Pride Month this June, with LGBTQ stories and voices across generations. You won't want to miss it. Again, that's June 13th at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City. You can get tickets now at tribecafilm.com/slowburn. Hope to see you there.
Tariq Kenney-Shawa has exactly one video up on his YouTube account. It's less than a minute long.
Hi, my name is Nirvana. I'm a teenager who's living in Gaza. I woke up
In this video, a 13-year-old girl in glasses and a Tweety Bird t-shirt looks straight to camera. She's recording herself inside a UNICEF tent in Gaza. She's trying to get out.
My uncle lost his kids and his wife because of the war. And he's in a tent right now. Please, we need your donation to escape from death. Please, we need your help. Please, we need to travel. Thank you so much.
Tariq has known this girl, her whole family really, for years now. Their home was destroyed back in October.
Yep, they're still living in a tent, which is basically everybody's situation right now.
In the last few days, the whole family relocated from Rafah to Mawasi, a coastal area that Israel's designated as a safe zone. It doesn't feel very safe, though.
They followed the orders as they've been following orders, for the past 8 months. And this is, I think, the third or the fourth time that they've been displaced. They used to live in northern Gaza, and they've been kind of, basically on the move ever since.
Tariq is Palestinian-American, a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, a think tank. He is raising money for this family. His friend Hytham's got 2 kids, a wife, his brother, 9 family members total, all of whom want nothing more than to get out of Gaza. Is there one detail that your friend tells you about how they're living that you can't shake?
Right now, it's the heat and the paranoia of the drones. And basically, whenever I speak to Haytham and whenever I speak to anyone on the phone, it's this constant droning in the background that you can hear is the surveillance or the attack drones that Israel flies over Gaza constantly. And, in Gaza, it's surpassing hundreds of degrees during the day and with, little food and water. So what we are most concerned about right now is that heat and is the fact that disease spreads quicker in the heat and is the fact that Israel has basically destroyed Gaza's entire healthcare infrastructure system, making it so that, everyday Palestinians cannot receive even basic, healthcare.
The most brutal part of this story is that Haytham's family isn't even supposed to be in Gaza anymore. After Tariq raised $30,000 for them, they secured a place on an evacuation list. Not for everyone, just for Haytham's wife and kids.
Yeah, they're close, but the latest obstacle we've run into is that after Israel took over the Rafah crossing, they closed the border and there haven't been evacuations since. So hundreds of people in Gaza are on that evacuation list.
And they're stuck.
But they're not able to leave, yeah. And they've paid, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get themselves and their families out. So it's a moment of uncertainty coupled with deep, deep fear of what the summer is going to bring.
Today on the show, a window into Rafah, why rumored ceasefire deals aren't making Tariq's family and friends feel any safer. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Discover. When it comes to your finances, Discover wants you to know they are the credit card that is always there for you. With 24/7 U.S.-based live customer service, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We are talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar. Today's review, the hotter, juicier classic burgers. Mr. Hamburglar. Rubble, rubble. He said, of all the McDonald's burgers I've ever hamburgled, these are the hottest, juiciest, and tastiest. Rubble.
Hamburglary is on the rise. Get caught with a medium double cheeseburger meal for $6. Price and participation may vary. Promotion pricing may be lower than meal price. Comparison to prior classic burgers.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
You'd be forgiven for feeling taken aback when Israeli forces entered Rafah last month. Because in an interview back in March, President Biden called the invasion of the southern Gaza city a red line for the U.S. Sort of.
Would invasion of Rafah, which you have urged him not to do, would that be a red line?
It is a red line, but I'm never going to leave Israel. The defense of Israel is still critical. So there's no red line. I'm going to cut off all weapons so they don't have the Iron Dome to protect them. They don't have. But there's red lines that if he crosses, and you cannot have 30,000 more Palestinians dead.
But Tariq says he always knew some kind of operation would move forward in Rafah, no matter what.
What the past couple of months have shown us is that the Biden administration doesn't actually have any red lines. But he's been, recognizing that, Israel's assault on Gaza is becoming increasingly unpopular. It's increasingly leading to Israel's isolation. And it's becoming an increasing, a growing liability on his own reelection campaign. And I think that's kind of what prompted his response in that interview where he said that Rafah, a full-on invasion of Rafah would be a red line for him. But what we've seen since is that we've seen that red line shift, right? We've seen that red line shift basically with each Israeli incursion or with each Israeli advancement until we got to that Rafah massacre where Israel carried out the airstrike on the refugee camp, killing at least 45 Palestinians.
I mean, dozens of Palestinian civilians died when Israel bombed an area where displaced people were living, and they were living in tents. They were so clearly refugees. Refugees on top of refugees, you could say.
Yeah.
I mean, afterwards, Israel, specifically Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, called what happened a tragic mistake. What did you think when you heard those words?
I thought it was ironic, and I think it also follows kind of Israel's precedent that Israel has set. What we saw with Netanyahu calling that specific attack a tragedy and promising an internal investigation is basically what he's been doing for the past several months, is that when, we reach these, quote unquote turning points, when we reach these, for example, attacks like the attack on the World Central Kitchen workers, now the attack in Rafah, public opinion around the world shifts, right? Outcry towards Israel shifts. Israel becomes increasingly isolated and sees that, okay, we have to respond to this international outcry. And how they do that is by apologizing and promising they will initiate an internal investigation. However, the internal investigations never lead to any form of accountability. Sometimes here and there an officer will get a slap on the wrist, but systemically nothing changes. The fact that Israel targets civilians indiscriminately, that never changes.
When you saw the images from that strike in Rafah, did you think, okay, the U.S. is going to have to respond in some way to this? President Biden is going to have to say something.
Yeah, I think the images that came out of Rafah a couple days ago were undeniably grotesque. But to tell you the truth, they're not too different from the images that we've been seeing coming out of Gaza as a whole for months now. We've seen people ripped apart. We've seen babies with full body burns. We've seen beheaded babies. We've seen some of the worst images that we've basically ever seen in our lives come out of Gaza.
It was really arresting to listen to what happened when a CBS News reporter asked the White House for a response to this and explicitly said, how does this not violate the red line that the president laid out?
So how does this not violate the red line that the president laid out?
As I said, we don't want to see a major ground operation. We haven't seen that at this point.
Which is just it's a fine line to say, well, it was an operation by air, and so this isn't the red line, even though it looks terrible. I just wonder if that surprised you.
I think it would have surprised me if this was 1 or 2 months in. But what we've seen is the Biden administration has basically been shifting the goalposts for 8 months, right? And, if these images had come out of Ukraine, or if these images had come out of basically anywhere else, we would have gotten an overwhelming response by the Biden administration saying it, explicitly calling it a violation of international law. But the reality of the situation is that the current administration and many Americans across the board just don't have that same empathy towards Palestinians. They don't see themselves in Palestinians. And that's, I think, at the root of the issue often here. But kind of going back to the Biden administration here, what they've been doing is kind of shifting the goalposts on what they claim to be an acceptable level of force in Gaza, right? And we saw this with the invasion of Rafah and saying that, first they said a limited ground incursion would be acceptable, but not the use of, for example, 2,000-pound bombs. And then we see this strike on the Rafah camp, and that moment kind of showed is that it kind of exposed the double standard that the U.S. is applying to Gaza and has been applying for 8 months, and it showed that there is no red line for this administration and that they're willing, at the end of the day, to cover for Israel no matter what.
I think the Biden administration would see it slightly differently, which is they would see it as Israel's response does not get more humane when they're isolated. And so the only way to influence the Israeli response is to tread carefully. Do you think that's a fair way of representing them? I'm just sort of curious what you'd say to that.
Yeah, I think that has been the Biden administration's tactic for the last 8 months. And I think we've seen that fail over and over again. And the Biden administration has been unwilling and unable to learn from that mistake. We saw at the beginning in October when Biden first visited Israel and embraced Netanyahu on the tarmac. And that was kind of seen as a symbolic representation of the wider U.S. strategy towards Israel, which was, in public, a bear hug embrace, but in private, using back-channel diplomacy and kind of, backstage diplomacy to influence their operations. And, the Biden administration, to this day, continues to insist that this is the right approach. But we have not seen any change to Israel's operations. We haven't seen any decline in the Palestinian civilian death toll. We've seen a continuation of war crime after war crime, because at the end of the day, Israel doesn't respond to the bear hug approach. Israel will only respond to more punitive measures like conditioning aid or cutting it entirely, sanctioning and boycotting.
Last Friday night, President Biden seemed to shift gears. He gave a speech and claimed that Israeli officials had arrived at a ceasefire deal that met Hamas's requirements. In fact, it looked a lot like a deal Hamas had already agreed to last month.
Israel has offered a comprehensive new proposal. It's a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and the release of all hostages. This proposal has been transmitted by Qatar to Hamas.
By revealing these plans, President Biden was essentially saying, these parties can come to terms here if they want to. But Tariq says that doesn't mean he sees this war coming to an end anytime soon.
Some people are saying, Biden is kind of playing 4D chess here by calling both sides bluff, but I don't see it that way. I think in order to call, for example, Israel's bluff, he's going to need to actually put some political and diplomatic and economic weight behind that. There has to be some sticks that come with the carrots, if that makes sense. because the sticking point now is that Israel doesn't actually want this to end without either their full defeat of Hamas, and Hamas doesn't want this to end without Israel leaving the Gaza Strip, because then they can't chalk this up as a victory. So that's where we're at right now, is that, yes, this is a ceasefire proposal that both sides have expressed positivity towards. However, neither side is going to accept it without a further push.
I guess I wonder, from your perspective, if a ceasefire deal with Hamas that means Israeli forces leave Gaza totally, is that good for Palestinians? It feels like it leaves Hamas in charge, like de facto the bosses.
In my opinion, what Palestinians have been asking for is self-determination, right? And Palestinians want to have control over their political futures. Palestinians want control over their, basically their destiny and their fate. And anything is better than continued Israeli occupation.
Some might hear what you're saying and think you're pro-Hamas. I just want to give you a chance to respond to that explicitly if you want to.
Yeah, no, I think what I'm just trying to do is kind of explain the political reality on the ground in Gaza, and explain that, Palestinians in Gaza have a varying views of Hamas. Some support Hamas because they see them as a resistance group. Some oppose Hamas because they see it as an oppressive, authoritarian, basically dictatorship that has ruled over them since 2007. But basically what I'm saying is that Hamas isn't going anywhere, and that's the reality of the situation. As many military analysts have said, you cannot militarily defeat Hamas because it's a lot more than just a political party and fighting group. It's an idea. It's a resistance group that is resisting against decades of Israeli occupation and blockade. So if you really want to defeat Hamas, you have to attack the roots that created it in the first place. So if we want to talk about a future without Hamas, we need to talk about a future in which Palestinians can achieve self-determination and choose their future and rebuild Gaza in a way that gives them hope, right, to live.
We'll be right back. I want to explicitly talk about what could come after this war. Because it will end at some point, even though it feels like it can't end now because there have been so many back and forths. There have been so many debates about what the day after plan would be in Gaza. Like, what's the political structure? One Palestinian analyst we spoke to said basically there is no day after for Gazans, because the fallout from this war will last such a long time that, like, even after the war is over, the war will still be there. Is that how you see it too?
I agree 100%. I think there's a lot of time and energy we spend, for example, focusing on calling for a ceasefire. And what I worry about is that, someday we will reach a ceasefire. Someday they will agree on a ceasefire. But that is just going to be the start of a new phase of this tragedy. Most of Gaza is now unlivable. So even if there is a ceasefire that is reached today, that is only the start of a humanitarian crisis that is going to last decades. We have more than half of Gaza's structures, buildings, houses have been destroyed. 1.8 million Palestinians, that's almost, the entire population of Gaza, has fallen into abject poverty. Gaza's hospital system is completely destroyed. We've seen the wholesale destruction of all civilian infrastructure. Israel has specifically targeted sewage systems. They've specifically targeted energy grid. They've specifically targeted power plants, hospitals, schools, and every university in Gaza has been destroyed. So basically, we could reach a ceasefire today, and much of the world will turn away and wipe their hands of it and say, job well done. But in Gaza, Palestinians are going to have to pick up the pieces, and this process is going to take decades.
Do you think about what that process will be like? Like, so many people there. I know that they're probably just thinking about the practical reality of survival at this point. But do they think, too, about a year from now and, doing the work of rebuilding and how to even start.
I mean, it feels very premature to be discussing. Of course, it feels very premature to be discussing the day after in Gaza when people are still being massacred every day. But I think it's also important to kind of like look at what Israel has been doing operationally on the ground in Gaza to get an idea of what they have in mind. And, a lot of people say Israel doesn't have a plan for Gaza's future. Israel is kind of just acting in anger and in revenge from October 7th, and they don't actually have a concrete strategy of what comes next. And I'm not sure I fully agree with that, because what we've seen on the ground is Israeli forces have bisected the Gaza Strip in two, into north and south, right? And they've increased the buffer zone around Gaza. A recent study, I think by Al Jazeera, just came out and found that over 30% of Gaza's land has been kind of sucked up by Israel's buffer zones and the Netzarim corridor that bisects the Gaza Strip in half. And so what Israel is trying to do is ensure that it has full-on military control of Gaza and can enter and exit when it wants for the next coming years and potentially decades.
Yeah, I think it's accurate to say that Israel doesn't have a plan for Palestinian rule in Gaza.
Yeah.
But Israel, what you're describing here is a continuation of the Israeli plan to further separate Palestinians into smaller and smaller areas and maintain control over the borders.
Yeah, basically what I'm trying to say is that Israel has a plan for furthering its maximum land with minimum Palestinians approach, which has kind of guided their strategy since day one in 1948. And how they're going to do this is basically establish two separate, distinct concentration camps within Gaza, divided by that Netzarim corridor. And both of them will be very highly surveilled. And if they, do maintain a full-on occupation of the Gaza Strip during the years to come, that is how they will project control and pacify Gaza's population for the years to come.
I just want to say concentration camps is such a loaded term to use for these areas.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Why do you use it?
I think because it is a loaded term, and I think that's what describing that situation needs. Because basically what we're looking at are concentration camps. For decades, people have described Gaza as the largest open-air prison in the world, right? Palestinians cannot leave or enter without Israel's explicit permission. That's a prison. And right now, what Israel is creating in the Gaza Strip are two concentration camps that will be highly surveilled, basically prisons that will be much more securitized than Gaza has ever been. And within that are already decimated. So people will be living in the midst of rubble, surrounded by Israeli forces, basically only sustained on whatever Israel decides to let in terms of humanitarian and food aid. And I think it's important to call that what it is, and that sounds a lot like concentration camps.
You've said Palestinians need to have a say in what comes next in Gaza. And I'm really curious what that practically means for you when Palestinian leadership, like the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, for instance, has been undermined and sidelined for years.
Yeah.
And what that means when the current de facto leaders in Gaza, Hamas, that is a terrorist group. I just wonder how you get over that to get to the place where Palestinians do have autonomy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I like to describe it as, the Palestinians, we have a representation crisis, and we have had for a long time. But one of the major tragedies of, 76 plus years of occupation and 16 years of blockade of Gaza is that Palestinians have been deliberately precluded from cultivating a political and these political institutions that we need to build our state, to push towards self-determination. And the responsibility lays on all the authorities that kind of lead over our lives, right? Hamas, for example, for being an authoritarian government in Gaza. The responsibility lays on the Palestinian Authority for crushing dissent in the West Bank, and on Israel for being the occupying power and being the apartheid state that it is.
All these failed groups are the ones who are negotiating for what happens next.
Exactly. And that's the biggest tragedy of it all, is that the conversation on what happens on the next, like, the next day in Gaza conversation is being held and dominated by these parties that, in many cases don't have the interests of the Palestinian people at heart. We continue not to have a seat at the table in these official deliberations. And as long as the people don't have a seat at the table, then this cycle is just going to continue, and we're going to find ourselves in the same place as we are now, years to come.
It's interesting. I interviewed an Israeli woman last week. She clearly felt so isolated, and she felt like the world was turning against Israel. And when I asked her what it would mean to take Palestinian pain seriously, she was defensive. She basically said, most of the world has taken a stance on Palestine, and they stand with Palestinians, at least from what I've seen. And not enough people seem to take Israeli pain seriously. I wonder what you'd say to an Israeli person who's feeling that.
That's an interesting perspective. I think it looks very different from the perspective of a Palestinian and a Palestinian American. But from the perspective of, for example, a Palestinian in Gaza, they see the whole Western world arrayed behind Israel. They see American weapons falling on their heads. They see Israeli forces killing their families, and they basically kind of see the whole, the world with power arrayed against them. And of course, around the world, Israel is becoming increasingly isolated because people see the war crimes it's committing and see the injustice in the 76 years of occupation. But for a Palestinian, that doesn't give them solace, right? While American weapons are falling on their heads. Israel has been an occupying force for over 76 years. They've forced Palestinians to live in an apartheid system for that long. And now they're committing a genocide in Gaza. And I think Israel needs to feel isolated, and it needs to face punitive measures in order to be held accountable for what it's doing.
Tariq, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Tariq Kenney-Shawa is the U.S. Policy Fellow at Al-Shabaka and an editor and fact-checker for AJ+. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osborne, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little boost from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you back here next time.